What's up, guys, and welcome back to MoAn Inc. If you guys are new here, then hello. My name's Erica, and it is a pleasure to have you joining me today on the channel. Because for today's video, as you can see from the title, we are going to be chatting about the famous Aesop. But before we can get into that, please don't forget to hit the subscribe button and the bell icon so that you know every single time I post in the future. And now that you've so kindly done that, let's get into the video. Aesop is a name that I think everybody has heard. Even if it's not for Aesop's Fables, hey, I'm going to allow the idea that some people have accidentally stumbled here because they just know Aesop, the like soap brand or whatever the hell that is. The really fancy, really nice looking soap and like facial thing brand. They do cleaning things for humans. What the brand is. So we're not going to be talking about that today. Obviously, we're here to talk about the man who wrote Aesop's Fables. Now, I wanted to do this episode because I think this is one that a lot of people maybe take for granted. You know, we hear of Aesop's Fables and no one really questions who is Aesop. Do we know anything about him? And so I thought it would be kind of fun to put together everything that we know, and especially about the Fables and the history of the Fables, into one place that we can have a little, place to kind of refer to and talk from about the guy behind these famous stories. So when it comes to who Aesop is, we know next to nothing about him. And this is what's really important to highlight throughout this video, and that's because when you Google Aesop, there are so many websites that are like, he wasn't this, he wasn't that, he's from here, he's from blah, 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 blah. It is important that I tell you guys, because someone has to. There are so many ideas of who Aesop could be, and that's because no one really knows anything about him. Not now, but in the ancient world, there was nobody who wrote anything on Aesop, nobody who knew him personally. Everything that we hear about Aesop himself comes from people much later than Aesop, and therefore he becomes more so this kind of like legendary figure. That's not to say that the ancients viewed him as a legend. That's not to say that we should view him as a legend. There are lots of people in my little corner of the world that certainly would say that Aesop is more so like a name that they use rather than a person. Does that make sense? Like there is a school of thought that do not think that Aesop existed and that he is much more used as a name in the same way that I explained that in my Homer context video. There are some people that don't think that Homer was one person but like a collection of bards, That's kind of the same idea with Aesop. However, we do have a lot of people that write these ideas of Aesop, of who the man was, people who, like ancient people, who were not theorizing, maybe Aesop wasn't real. These are people who were like, yes, Aesop is real, but who was he? There are a number of different stories, and only like two things tend to come up again and again and again. Those two facts about Aesop is one, that he is born, raised, existed in the 6th century BC or BCE. And the second one is that he was a slave. Now, not all of them state that he was a slave. Not all of the various stories about him state that he was a slave. But these are the two most common facts about him that pop up again and again. So when you Google, like, who is Aesop or, like, context for Aesop, a lot of sites will say he was a slave and he was from the 6th century BC or BCE. But that is not all of them, and it is not certain. Now, I thought that it would be fun if as a family we could go through some of these various stories about Aesop, so I did write them down, and these are from, again, ancient sources. The ancient sources are theorizing who Aesop was, and this goes back to Herodotus, right? So Herodotus, who's writing in the 5th century BC or BCE, he says that Aesop lived in the 6th century and that he was a slave, right? That's what Herodotus says. Plutarch, though, picks this up in the 1st century CE, and he claims that Aesop, though living in the 6th century BC or BCE, much like Herodotus, he differs from Herodotus in saying that he was the advisor to a king of Lydia. Very different, but okay, that's what Plutarch claims. There is then a number of different sources that do hold the idea that he's from Thrace. There are a number of other people, so a collection of various ancient authors that will say he's from Phrygia, and some even from as far as Ethiopia. Now, there is one really interesting source from the 1st century CE that claims, and this is a wild ride, guys, so buckle up. This one claims that Aesop was actually born and raised on the island of Samos. He is then a slave who is given his freedom, goes to Babylon, solves a riddle in Babylon for King Lycurgus, okay, and then ends up in Delphi, and that's how he dies, in Delphi. So that is those are kind of like all the different ideas about Aesop. The reason why I wanted to say those is because that way you can see that there are so many ideas about this one person because he had written these fables, and people are nosy. So we have a lot of different stories. When you go online, just be aware that when you read any of them, there are so many other stories about this man that we don't know anything about him at all, which is fun when you have a context episode. Maybe I didn't think this through. No, of course I did. We are here because I wanted to talk about the fables as well. So even though with Aesop, we don't know that much about him, we do know about his fables. Now, first and foremost, what is a fable? In case you guys clicked on this and you're just kind of like, yeah, I know that there are like all of these little stories, but what is a fable? Right, why was this a really integral thing that happened with Aesop, and why was it different? And that's because on this channel we've gone through so many different myths and mythographers and people who are writing histories and all of that kind of stuff, stories, you know, has that video come out yet? I don't know what order any of these are coming out in, but I did a video on Apuleius, who wrote The Golden Ass, which is just a fictional book. It's not a myth, it's just a story that he wrote. So we have a number of those happening in the ancient world. And Aesop becomes really famous for his fables. And the fable, what makes it different is that they're much shorter, for starters, but also a fable involves animals acting in a human way to go through some kind of morality tale. And in particular, what makes a fable is that the animals are not acting as animals. They are acting as humans. They are dealing with very human problems and they are resolving them in very human ways. But they are small, they are easy to understand, and that is why they are often told to children, because children can then therefore integrate and experience these kinds of morality questions without actually having to do them. Obviously, kids will be kids. We've all been kids at one point, and you do very much have to learn things the hard way. But fables are really interesting because, especially with Aesop's fables, they tend to be this kind of pillar of what it means to be a human, in the sense of humans have always and will always tell stories. And fables are one version of this. So originally we think that the fables were just passed down to people orally, right? So in the same way when I was saying with Homer that's what we thought of the story of Troy and the Odyssey, it's told to a meter and all of this, obviously that's not exactly the same thing with Aesop when it comes to the meter and the way of telling the story, the beat of the story and knowing that it would have been performed. But the idea that you would kind of sit around and tell kids these stories or tell other people these stories seems to be integrated into the idea of fables as well, in particular Aesop's. So there's this really interesting idea of storytelling when it comes to Aesop's fables. And the reason why I'm mentioning that is because something I always say with myth, which is so important to bear in mind here, is that myths are told and retold in different periods of time, performed in different ways, or spoken in different ways to different audiences that react differently to them. Now, I know that was a lot for one sentence, but it's important to bear that in mind because when you see an original myth and then you see a retelling that is different and the characters are different, but we know was really popular, it tells us a lot about the time period, the people who were listening to it, and the person who wrote it. It tells about their values, it tells us about what they wanted to see versus what they had seen before, whether it's just they were hungry for something different, or that myth in particular was speaking to them, or changing of this character showed us the values that are changing in society. All of those things are fascinating and so brilliant when studying the ancient world. And that is the same with the fables. So although we might not have all of the original Aesop versions of the fables, the ones that keep changing and sort of keep moving with time, the ones that we end up with, they teach us a lot about different time periods. So even looking at the ones from the 1st century CE that we know were Aesop's fables that are then kind of written and established. What word am I looking for? Not rewritten. It doesn't, reimagined. That's the word I was looking for. When we have the Roman poet who is dealing with them and reimagining them, we have to bear in mind that little things might change, little moral lessons, little words might change, because all of those things would resonate more with his audience. They resonate more with his time period. And that is such a fun thing to get your teeth into when you study this subject and to figure out the reception of these things in the time periods. Now, obviously, I will not be going into every single one of Aesop's fables. Oh my goodness, we would be here all day. I have zero desire to do that. At some point, I might do like a sort of joint episode. I'm talking about a couple of them, maybe, if I want to. I don't see myself doing that, maybe. But for the moment, I will just link all of the links that I can find to Aesop's Fables in the description below, as well as some really good YouTube videos that I found of people retelling Aesop, because that'll be like the absolute last thing when I run out of things to do. If I'm still on YouTube in like 10 years, if YouTube is still a thing in 10 years, and I'm like, crap, now what? I've done everybody. I might do some fables. I don't think that's going to happen. So you can find all of the other things, all of the other links, all of the other sources in the description below in case you want to engage with that, as well as some interesting articles that I found about Aesop to kind of ground you a little bit more in the academic discussion about this ancient man. But thank you guys so much for tuning in to this episode of MoAn Inc. I hope you guys enjoyed it, and I'll be seeing you next time with more videos here on the channel. I'll see you guys then.